Part 3. Simon the Necromancer. The box might as well be empty, thought Simon. Tears did not roll down his face like they rolled down the faces of some of those surrounding him. Tears threatened him by wetting his lashes and stinging his eyes, but none of them fell. Simon was too angry, too bitter. At who, he did not really know. He guessed the anger was directed at Jonah, whose name was inscribed on the rock in front of him. That box, the coffin that might as well be empty, was being slowly lowered into the ground. None of what made Jonah, was left in that box. What was there was merely a shell of the cheery young man that would have greeted Simon in the past. Now there was nothing left of Jonah but that empty box, that shell of man devoid of that immaterial something, their ego, that makes an individual the person that they are. That rock, the tombstone in front of him, showed the name Jonah Pickman and the dates 2002 to 2019. The hardest thing to look at in the whole damn cemetery were those numbers, Simon thought. 2002, 2019. The numbers are too close together. They are not separated by a great enough factor. Subtract one from the other and it doesn't even factor as high as 20. Tears did not roll, but Simon was feeling sick to his stomach. It was too late for any final goodbyes at this point. The box containing the useless dead remains of what was once Simon's best friend was now being covered in dirt, moistened by a light drizzle. The best weather that could be expected from this time of year, Simon supposed, as he looked forward, out of the arc of people that surrounded that hole in the ground. Their faces held signs of distraught or outright sobs. He saw the road leading back out of the cemetery and found solace, distraction, in the light fog that was setting along that road. A light fog and drizzle. Simon ruminated on how it was the perfect weather to set the occasion. As an artist, Jonah would have appreciated the addition of rain for the ambience. The thought caused a slight smile to form on Simon's face for a second. But only for that second, because in that same moment is when the tears finally came. It was after the funeral. Many of those there before had already left, when Simon felt a hand laid upon his shoulder. The older man was wearing a black suit, not just for the occasion at hand, as Simon knew. He always wore that suit. The man was Simon's uncle and teacher of necromancy. Necromancy was a funny trade among mages. Like everything else, the knowledge and ability of necromancy was transferred through the Akashic and the collective unconscious memory. However, it was a form of hereditary knowledge, men in Simon's family naturally inheriting the gift. Older generations of the family training younger generations. You know I'm sorry for your loss, Simon. We can skip training for today. We'll train later, starting again tomorrow at the usual time. His uncle paused, collecting his thoughts, dreading what he would have to say, but knowing he had to. It was what must be told to all students of his craft eventually. Simon, I know that you are a smart kid, but there is a time of weakness in everyone's life when they lose a friend or family member. But you have to know, deep down past the hurt, the emotion, that they can't come back. Even with our craft, not even we can bring them back. What we animate is what the dead have left behind. It's not them. Of course I know that. Simon realized he was yelling. He noticed a glance from others in the cemetery and lowered his voice. You know I know that, and I don't need this from you right now. Simon meant those words when he said them. He knew the powers his family had gave them no sway when it came to spirits, or the mind, or the ego, or whatever it was in a human that is not measured in flesh, and is extinguished when they die. All of that is beyond their influence. He could use his own mind, as ephemeral as all others, to do nothing other than animate mere flesh. What use were these powers anyway? It was a question he asked himself often. He learned the craft because of his ancestors. His parents had passed it down, and only he could continue its legacy. But for what? He couldn't answer that. As long as you know. His uncle nodded in his direction. He knew his words were no comfort to his nephew, but he needed to hear them. I'll see you tomorrow, then. Simon answered coolly, and then began walking away towards his car. Until then. Later that day, after everyone had left the cemetery and would not be able to see his car, Simon returned to park across from the cemetery. There was an old shack across the road from the cemetery that was out of use, presumably used to house a past gravekeeper. The paint on the door was sparse, and where present was weathered and peeling, revealing the scratched, cracked wood of the door underneath. The door handle and hinges were rusted. Simon winced almost preemptively to the harsh, grinding sound of the rusted hinges made as the door opened. He heard this noise many times, but never got used to it. He walked directly towards the stairs to the second floor, steps squeaking as he made his way up the steps. The room was empty except for a couple of chairs, an art easel, and a few paintings leaned against the wall, a sheet thrown over them to protect them from dust. Simon grabbed a chair and pulled it next to the window, the only source of light being the waning rays from a setting sun that found their way past the clouds and through the glass of that window. The window overlooked the cemetery. In this room, no matter how many times his friends and relatives complained about the morbidity of it, is where Jonah Pickman spent his time painting his portraits. He had told Simon that the ambiance of this building overlooking the graveyard is what fueled his creativity, his inspiration. Simon knew how others viewed Jonah because of that. They saw it as a depressing excuse to be here, but Simon knew how bright Jonah would smile in the many upbeat conversations the two of them had in this room. Simon examined the painting still sitting on the easel. The image was of a snake, with 3 pairs of wings lining its body. The greens and blacks of the snake's scales and the whites and grays of its wings were accentuated by the bright yellows, oranges, and reds that constituted the fire that surrounded its body. The fire's origin seemed to be the snake itself, as if the flames were as much a part of the snake's being as the scales of its body, or the 6 wings that were outstretched on either side, leaving the snake in the image in perpetual flight. The flying, flaming snake's mouth was open, fangs bared, as if attempting to strike those who were viewing the image. So surreal, Simon thought. Jonah had one hell of an imagination. It's just what I see in my head, Jonah would sometimes explain, his voice ringing in Simon's memory. But this painting was different. Simon remembered Jonah anxiously explaining how he saw this in a dream. Jonah was convinced something big was going to happen soon. Simon winced as he remembered his reaction. Jonah saying he had a premonition of some unseen threat sending these snake creatures forth. Simon merely laughed those worries off. It's just a dream. There's nothing to worry about. Hell, Simon thought. I'm a necromancer. Jonah knew nothing of that, or the mages that Simon was instructed by. But Jonah having a premonition, that would be far less crazy than all the magic he had already accepted as true. On the back of the painting was the title, Seraphim, and underneath this was the name Jonah Pickman, written in pen. It was the last painting he had made before taking his own life. Simon carefully placed the painting back on the easel. He walked down the squeaky steps and out through the door with the screeching hinges. He sat in his car as the sun set, began to start the car, but stopped short of doing so. He leaned his arm on the steering wheel, buried his face in his arms, and wept. Simon was startled by the loud ringing of a bell that signaled the end of class. It was just a normal school day. Sure, there was some uneasiness among some of the students, and Simon got looks from some of his peers who knew about his and Jonah's friendship and his passing, but it was just another normal day. Simon could not really focus well on class, though. Simon gathered his things and entered the flow of traffic towards the hallway. Zhao, I've been meaning to talk to you. Simon overheard a familiar voice in the hallway. He turned in that direction and saw Isabel and Zhao. Yeah, what's up, Izzy? Geez, how many times have I told you not to call me Izzy? You never change. Really, you don't think I've become more curvaceous over the years? What does that have to do with anything? Same old Izzy. I'm the only one who can get under your skin. Get serious. I came to talk to you about all the time you spent at the asylum. We barely hang out anymore. I don't think my time at the asylum is any of your business. I just don't want you to turn out like them. They're my parents, and your parents are there too. You should understand. I do understand, but I also recognize I cannot do anything to help them. I don't want their madness to spread to you. You're asking me to abandon them. I can't do that. Zhao turned to leave. Wait, you know that's not what I meant. Isabel called out to her, but she was already walking away. Isabel sighed as she looked away, catching sight of Simon. She put on a smile, surely meant to be reassuring, and approached him. How you feeling, Simon? Simon saw the faint outlines of circles underneath her eyes. She must be feeling as tired as he is. I am, well. I keep thinking back on what Jonah had said about his dreams being a signal of something big to come. He said he had a premonition. Isabel listened intently as he talked and nodded in understanding. She was a good friend. He really could not stop pouring what he was feeling. He had to get it off his chest somehow, and there was no one else he had to talk to. Rationally, I realized that his premonition was just his own way of externalizing the anxiety he was feeling. And right now, by entertaining the possibility that he might have actually predicted something, I'm doing something similar. Distracting myself by focusing on some unknown threat that he somehow predicted. It distracts me from the reality of the situation, which is I lost my friend. Maybe by entertaining those last anxiety-induced statements he gave me, maybe that will lead to my own madness. Everyone seems to be going mad around here, and I cannot help but think that I might be the next one. I don't think that's true, Simon. You're a strong person who will pull through this. I'm here for you if you ever need to talk. Isabel stopped to think. I know how it is to lose someone you care for. It may not seem right to compare our situations, but this is where I'm coming from. My parents aren't dead, but seeing them in that hospital, they're not the same people they were before. I can neither talk nor laugh with them the same way I did before. They barely recognize me on a good day. I know how it feels to lose someone. Isabel looked away for a moment and sighed. Thanks, Isabel. Simon felt reassured in the fact he had others. Though the pain he felt was personal, everyone around him has felt pain like he has, or will. There was no reason to feel alone. There was the sound of another bell. They both laughed at the realization they would be late for the next class. The final bell rang. Simon packed his stuff slowly, not out of lethargy, but out of attention to detail. He was starting to really tune into the details around him. The teacher asked him if he was okay, in which he answered he was fine. The teacher seemed surprised at the earnestness of the smile that followed his answer. Simon carried his bag into the hall, taking in the sights of the lockers, the trophy case, the posters on the wall. Simon felt relaxed, accepting the world around him as it was, not how he wished it to be, not how it can disappoint. This easy feeling ended when he walked out of the school. His uncle was waiting outside, arms crossed, face red. Something had happened. Simon always knew his uncle as an easygoing individual, not one to be easily worked into a fury. Simon approached him. You're finally out, huh? Yeah, my final class just ended. So you have no idea of what happened at the cemetery? What? It felt like the blood had drained out of Simon's face. It was reported that one of the graves may have been tampered with. The whether or an animal will be given as an explanation, but the reality is, it appears, is that the hole was dug from underneath, and the body is missing. He paused. Simon felt the cold sweat as his knees wobbled. Do you have any idea which grave it is I am speaking of? He asked accusingly, not really a question. Simon just gaped, looking for an answer. His uncle stared, almost glared at Simon's face, looking for any reaction, any giveaway he may give that he was responsible for whatever had happened. The way a mother looks at a child who had stolen a cookie from the jar, or broke a window while playing. In any case, already sure of the accused's guilt, but not completely sure on how to continue. So they ask a question for an answer they already are sure of, the patronizing tone failing to cover the anger in his voice. I have no idea what happened. He knew his uncle did not believe him, and even worse was the fear of what the reality actually was. You have no idea? Are you telling me the people who saw your car parked across from the cemetery are lying? I was looking at Jonah's portraits across the road. His uncle merely cocked his head to the side, shoulders slumped, as if Simon just said the dumbest thing he had heard that week. Am I going to believe that, Simon? The worry that Simon had felt, the confusion, was gone after this question. It was replaced with anger. You know what? I don't really care what you believe. Simon began to walk away. Simon, wait! His uncle demanded, reaching a hand out to catch him. Without turning, Simon merely raised his own hand to block his and continued on. The next day at school, Simon was spacing out again, this time trying to work out an explanation of the events his uncle had told him. He could not work anything out. He slumped backwards into his chair and he stretched his legs as far forward as the desk in front of him allowed. He tried to ignore the headache that the confusion had surely caused and stared forward, trying to appear like he was focused on what was being taught, when in reality he was zoning out completely, only to be awakened by the final bell of the school day. His uncle was outside again that day. Simon really did not want to talk to him, but his uncle looked more worried, anxious, like someone who was in a rush, this replacing the anger he had displayed the day before. Simon sighed before approaching him. Hey, Simon, we got a visit. Oh, we being the esoteric order that is, from. The esoteric order was the group of mages that taught new initiates, such as Simon and Isabel, so that much of the sentence Simon understood. The rest was just his uncle stumbling through what he was attempting to say. Simon not responding to it with any energy, he was too drained to feel confused or interested at all in what his uncle was trying to say. He just felt tired. What I'm trying to say is, we know you. I know you had nothing to do with what happened at the cemetery. Jonah broke into the library of the esoteric order and stole a very old, very powerful grimoire. And since you have been here at school with Isabel, you could not have been there when it happened. That's all I had to say, Simon. He began to walk away. Before he got too far away, he turned back. Listen, Simon, I'm sorry about how our conversation played out yesterday. Even if I had to suspect you, I did everything the wrong way, and I apologize for that. Simon gave him a slight nod and a small smile he knew had to have looked forced, but that was his way of saying that his apology was accepted. He was not angry with his uncle, that would have been foolish, but he also did not really feel much of anything at all right at that moment. A couple of hours after school, still plenty of time before the setting of the sun, Simon had found his way back to that shack that must have been a gravekeeper's abode at some point in history. He had no real reason of going. He just sat there in that room because he had nowhere else he needed to be, and he did not really want to be at home. There was no real way to help research the problem at hand, either. The problem being that a couple of days after the funeral of Jonah Pickman, it appears that he crawled back out of his grave. How could Simon possibly help the esoteric order find the culprit? He was part of a small group of people who even had the ability to learn how to be a necromancer due to the magical family line he was a member of, and if there were any others, his uncle would be the one to find them. If the event was caused by a strange being that arose out of the Akashic, then the other mages would be more knowledgeable in that field and more likely to find him. And even if Simon knew that it was a creature from the Akashic, the motives that being could have for resurrecting his friend would be incomprehensible to Simon anyway. The depths of the Akashic, as infinite as they would seem if one was to look upon the depths of the ocean, held gods or beings that after their initial conception have since been lost, the memory of them buried deep within the collective subconscious, their names or figures having long since been forgotten. There was no real start that Simon could think to begin at in order to find whoever or whatever caused the rise of his friend's shell from its tomb, and if his uncle or the esoteric order had no way of finding it, then what chance did Simon have? So he sat there in that little shack in which he had spent many afternoons. He remembered talking to Jonah there about the day at school, or normal things like that, distractions from the strangeness that was his life in the esoteric order. Jonah would smile and lay down his paintbrush, lean to the right on his chair to see around his art easel whenever he got really interested in the story Simon told, thin black hairband holding his hair back from his face while he painted. Simon laughed when he remembered Zhao complaining to Isabel about how strange and macabre it was for them to hang out in that shack next to the graveyard. Isabel would just shrug. How is it any more strange than what took place in the esoteric order? Simon sighed as he remembered Isabel and Zhao's conversation from the day before. They have problems all of their own, and Simon regretfully realized how removed he was from them. Distracted by his own thoughts, he gave no mind to the problems his friends were experiencing. Both of their parents were institutionalized after they came back from some trip they were all on together, driven mad by whatever they had seen. Simon had no way to effect any positive change over that situation, and he had no real in-depth knowledge about what had happened. He could merely soberly accept that his friends had found themselves in a situation that he had no power to help them through. Madness or anguish seemed to be taking over everyone around him these days, it seemed. Maybe the secret to life was finding the correct balance between madness and anguish, one counteracting the other so as to make sure the individual is not destroyed by either one. Simon jerked to attention as he heard the shrill scraping of the door as it was opened, and hurried to his feet as he heard the stairs creaking under someone's weight. "Simon, you up there?" Simon stifled a sigh of relief and sank back into a chair. It was Isabel. He was not sure what he was so worried about. The last couple of days had wound him up more than he recognized. "Yeah, I'm up here." Isabel poked her head into the room, smiling at Simon. "What are you doing up here?" "Nothing really, just hanging out, I guess. I can't really help the esoteric order find Jonah, and I have nothing else to do, so I'm just chilling out here. You aren't mad that I spied on you for your uncle, right?" His uncle did say something to that effect earlier, didn't he? Simon thought. That I could not have had anything to do with the break-in at the esoteric order, due to having been with Isabel at school. No, not at all. That would be a silly thing to be mad about. I guess so. Why did you come here anyway? The esoteric order must be busy with everything that's happening. They probably would have asked me to at least watch over the building while the actual mages were busy. That is, they would, if they didn't think that the last few days had messed me up. That's actually the reason I came to see if you were here. Because I messed up? Isabel laughed in response. Yeah, that. I was worried about you. It seems like lately. Well, with Jonah gone, with my parents in the hospital, with how Zhao has been lately, it feels like I'm losing those around me. How has Zhao been doing lately? I think she's spending too much time at the asylum. It's hard to explain, like, the other day I caught her mumbling to herself, almost incoherently, and she looked like she was in a daze when I shook her out of it, like she didn't recognize me. And also, it isn't like I can tell her that she shouldn't visit her parents in the hospital as often. That's not fair, and it's not my place to do so. It's just, maybe those books we inherited, that compulsion that was fostered in us to find more of the pages, fostered by watching and learning from our parents, maybe, in the end, this madness they are suffering from is just a part of that inheritance as well. They both suddenly tensed up as the sound of screams erupted from outside. They both rushed to the small window. There, outside the window, walking down the road, surrounded by a panicked group of people, was Jonah. No, Simon thought, that being that has taken Jonah's body. The being that had taken the form of Jonah looked up at the window of the building, as if he already knew for a fact that Simon and Isabel would be there, and gave a wink. With the initial shock of seeing Jonah waning, Simon took in the rest of the situation. Surrounding the panicked crowd, some circling Jonah as if they were some sort of defense, were these flashes of red and orange. It was flame. No, it was something flaming. Simon focused intently on one and realized with a shock what they were. Flying through the air and striking at the crowd of scared people were those winged, flamed snakes that had been the subject of Jonah's last painting. "We have to stop them!" Simon started to scream back, "What?" in reply, but he stopped. He knew exactly what he needed to do. They were in an old building across from a graveyard. Simon was an heir to a long line of necromancers. "I'm going to fight 'em back." Simon grabbed for the art easel and a brush. The sigil of necromancy had basically been burned into his memory from his uncle's training. Simon closed his eyes. The drawing of the mark of necromancy came almost autonomously, without an effort on Simon's part, focusing his energy over the graveyard, focusing on rising each of the dead from their tombs so they could start an attack on the monsters that were summoned by the being in the guise of Jonah. It took a near impossible amount of concentration. It was a feat that would be difficult for a seasoned necromancer, focusing on the rise of each individual and coordinating them in an effective collective. Simon grunted under the strain as a cloud entered into his mind. He was seeing the graveyard through a static as if he was trying to watch the events on TV through a busted satellite. Simon knew he had to focus on controlling the large group of dead he had arisen if there was any hope of defeating those creatures and saving the town. Simon knew, not from experience, but from reading his uncle's manuals, that effective squadrons could be implemented this way. Simon just needed the will to accomplish it. If he just had that will within him. Simon's teeth grinded as he strained to focus through that static that now seemed to have solidified. No longer was the image merely dimmed, it was completely concealed behind a wall of dancing, multicolored pixels. Simon grunted as he strained, his grinding teeth now bared. The cloud in his mind overtook him. He couldn't focus any harder, couldn't break through the cloud. A torrent of blood exploded from both of Simon's nostrils as he blacked out, his body unconscious before slamming onto the floor. Simon awoke to the world shaking around him. Simon grabbed the frame of the window, pulling himself into a position in which to view the chaos outside. It was a nightmare. Sure, some of the corpses Simon raised seemed to have gotten a hold of some of the flying snakes, though the fact that they had seemed to have been a fluke, just a naturally occurring accident that was bound to happen in the clamor below. Mainly it seemed that the raised dead were going to follow the monsters and Jonah into town. Simon let out a pained groan, the loudest one that he could muster in his weak state as he realized that he had only doubled the problem. He looked back towards Isabel. Isabel was frantically painting a sigil of some sort. "I'm not used to using a paintbrush to do these things. I'm going to summon a Shoggoth. They are supposed to be strong. I remember hearing of them from my parents, and summoning a Shoggoth she did." Simon stared in awe as something began to bubble forth in the middle of all the chaos taking place. It was dark green in color, semi-luminescent, and at any point Simon expected it to take some sort of form. But it did not. Even as its height began to reach 12 feet tall, it still remained a formless mass of bubbling, glowing sludge. Upon second look, Simon saw that each of the bubbles, upon popping, revealed an eye whose bloodshot pupils shot around wildly, taking in as much of the situation as possible, before sinking back into its fleshy, jelly-like body, only to pop out with a bubble on another part of it. That's when tendrils began to shoot out of the being, grabbing anything within its grasp indiscriminately. Simon scoured the scene, searching for that which had stolen the guise of Jonah, but he had already disappeared from the chaos at hand. Simon himself could barely watch the scene. The flaming snakes made a hiss as the fire that surrounded them was snuffed out as they were pulled into that mass. There were screams as people violently, futile as the effort may be, thrashed against the tendrils that pulled them, boiling into the flesh of that being, dissolving into it and reddening its dark green color. It only began to glow brighter as additional victims were taken. The corpses Simon raised, too, were sizzling within that beast. The smell of rotting flesh was being cooked within that wall of bubbling viscera filled the air. When that smell reached Simon's nostril, his shirt and the floor around him were covered in the bile that spewed from his mouth in response. Simon fell onto his side after vomiting. He lacked the energy or the desire to pull himself back up. Simon turned back as he heard a thud. Isabel had fallen to her knees, hands wildly grasping her face as her wide eyes took in the madness of what was happening outside, and her mouth gaped in terror. There was almost a catatonic, frozen look of dread that covered Isabel's face as she stared at the clamor below. The face was the last thing Simon saw before passing out. That's the whole story. The Shoggoth basically swallowed everything there in sight. Jonah had disappeared that day, and a few days later Zhao was nowhere to be found either. Okay. We heard from Long at the Esoteric Order that he was forming a government agency in order to follow supernatural cases such as the ones you have been a part of during the last few days. Isabel and I took the opportunity to join them in order to find Zhao and put Jonah back to rest. I think that basically catches you up on all that has happened thus far.